The topic of our discussion is the original New Testament lost? There is a very simple and forthright answer to that question, and I think Dan Wallace, in fact, will not disagree. The answer is yes. We do not have the originals of the New Testament, period. In order to understand what I mean by that, we have to realize how books were made in the ancient world. In the ancient world, when the Bible was produced, books could not be mass-produced. This was before electronic publication, Kinkos, or the printing press. Books were written by hand, and they were copied by hand. If you wanted a copy of a book, somebody had to copy it for you, or you had to copy it yourself. You copied it one page, one sentence, one word at a time. What happens when somebody sits down to try to copy a book by hand? Invariably what happens is they make mistakes, either on purpose or accidentally. Scribes who copied texts in the ancient world changed their texts. Let me explain how it worked by giving an example from the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark. We're not sure who Mark was, when he lived, where he lived. Whoever he was, he wrote a gospel. If anybody wanted a copy of this Gospel of Mark, they had to make a copy by hand, and so they did so. But invariably, they made a mistake or two or three or 20. When someone came along who wanted a copy of that copy, they copied the copy and they replicated the mistakes that the first copyist made. And they made their own mistakes. And then when a third person came along to copy the copy of the copy, they replicated the mistakes of both of their predecessors and made mistakes of their own. And it went on like this, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The only time mistakes got corrected in the process was when somebody was copying something and realized that there was a mistake and thought that his predecessor had made a mistake and so tried to correct the mistake. The problem is there's no telling whether a person who corrected the mistake corrected it correctly. It's possible that he corrected the mistake incorrectly, in which case you have three forms of the text: the original text, the text that was changed, and the incorrect correction of the change. Things like that go on for a very long time. We don't have the original copy that Mark made. We don't have the first copy. We don't have copies of the copy. We don't have copies of the 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 copies. The earliest copy that we have of Mark dates from around the year 200, probably about 130 years after the original. That's the first copy that we have, 130 years after the original. We don't have the originals of Mark or of any other book of the New Testament. The bigger question, though, is not whether we have the originals. The question is whether we can reconstruct the originals that have been lost. Can we reconstruct them or not? For many years, I thought that the answer was yes. That's going to be Dan's answer. But scholarship changed, and it became widely thought among scholars that we cannot reconstruct the original, and that it does not even make sense to talk about the originals. I started to understand why, and now I'm convinced. I can't give the full argument here, but I can mention three major questions that all point in the same direction. These are three problems in dealing with what I'm calling the original text. Problem one will be, what does it even mean to use the term original text? Problem two, where are the early manuscripts of the New Testament? And problem three, why can't scholars agree? So these are the three problems that I'll talk about in my 30 minutes with you. What does it even mean to use the term original text? I'm going to use one book of the New Testament as a particular example, 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians is one of the letters written by Paul to his congregation in the city of Corinth, one of the Pauline epistles. It can illustrate well why scholars are reluctant these days to talk about the original text on theoretical grounds. To begin with, we are missing the original. Whatever Paul wrote, we no longer have it. Our earliest copy of 2 Corinthians is a manuscript called P46. It dates from around the year 200. 2 Corinthians was probably written sometime in the 60s, and so we're talking about a manuscript that was 140 years after the original is our first manuscript of it. And it's not a complete manuscript. Our first complete manuscript of 2 Corinthians does not come until about the year 350. In other words, nearly 300 years of copying, with mistakes being made everywhere along the line before we have the first complete copy. So that's obviously a problem, but it's not the big problem I want to talk about. There are theoretical problems with even imagining what it might mean to call a text the original text of 2 Corinthians for several reasons. First, this first thing it might seem a little picayune and sort of trite to you, but in fact it's actually kind of interesting. We have good evidence that Paul dictated his letters to scribes who wrote down what he said. In other words, he didn't write himself, he dictated. We have solid evidence of this in the New Testament itself. We also have solid evidence from antiquity that when scribes took dictation, they often made mistakes. They misheard a word, somebody in the room coughed, or they didn't hear it right, they weren't paying attention, they wrote something down wrong. Suppose Paul dictated what we're calling 2 Corinthians, and the scribe wrote down wrong words. What is the original text? Is it the words that Paul spoke, or the words that the scribe wrote down? We don't have access to what Paul spoke, just what was written down, but what was written down might have had mistakes in it. Moreover, suppose what happened was what happened frequently in the ancient world, which is that the author looked at the written text once it had been written down and made corrections to it. Then what is the original text? Is the original text what the scribe originally wrote, or is it what Paul corrected? If it's what Paul corrected, then we're in the ironic situation that the later form of the text is being called the original text. And that could have happened a lot. But as I said, you might think that's a kind of a minor matter, and it's not the biggest problem. It's just an interesting problem. There's a bigger problem with respect to Paul writing 2 Corinthians, which is that Paul did not write 2 Corinthians. Paul did not write the letter of 2 Corinthians as it has come to us today. Scholars have long recognized for over a century that 2 Corinthians is made up of at least 2 different letters that have been spliced together. Chapters 10 through 13 do not come from the same letter as chapters 1 through 9. Not only that, there's a large number of scholars in both the United States and in Europe who maintain that 2 Corinthians, in fact, is made up of 5 separate letters that Paul wrote. In other words, Paul wrote 5 letters, and they were put in circulation and were copied and changed. 5 letters. These were circulated and changed until somebody created our 2 Corinthians by taking parts of these 5 letters and cutting them and pasting them together. This is a standard view in scholarship. You will find this taught in every major research university in North America, what I'm telling you now. This is not some kind of crazy idea that a particularly liberal professor at Chapel Hill thinks, although it is that. But it's not just that. This is standard fare in virtually everybody who's a critical scholar agrees with what I've just told you. But what does that mean then? Somebody created the letter some years, maybe a couple of decades after Paul wrote, so that Paul didn't create 2 Corinthians. Paul created up to 5 letters that had been in circulation and probably changed that were then combined into 2 Corinthians with a lot of the stuff cut out and other stuff put together. Then this letter, this amalgam, is put in circulation, and it's changed over time. And then something else happens that's equally significant, even more significant. It was argued over 50 years ago by one of the great scholars of the world of textual criticism, a man named Gunther Zuntz, that around the year 100, some editor came along and collected the letters of Paul into one manuscript. That there were separate letters that were floating around, being transmitted here, there, and the other, and somebody collected them into a collection, and this collection was published. This editor who collected the letters put the letters together and possibly put his own stamp on them. In other words, edited these letters to make them fit together into the collection. And then it was the collection that was put in circulation. Zuntz argued that all of our letters of Paul go back to that collection. This is not a weird point of view by just one particular scholar. Gunther Zunz's view has been supported by scholarship ever since, most recently supported, for example, by a very important book written by Harry Gamble, who, I'm sorry to say, teaches at the University of Virginia. But he's a nice guy anyway, and he's very smart. And he's one of the most recent people to argue this, that the Pauline letters were not circulated just individually around the year 100. They're put into a collection, and that all of our manuscripts of the letters of Paul go back to that collection. Or there may have been even more than one collection. But the Pauline letters were not circulating individually, they were circulated in collection. And as they circulated in the collection, of course, they got changed as scribes changed the manuscript. And so this leads us to the very pressing problem: what is the original of 2 Corinthians? It's a great question, and there's not an easy answer to it. There are a couple of obvious options. You could say that 2 Corinthians was the original letter that Paul wrote. Well, apart from the problems of dictation, you've got the problem that Paul didn't write a letter. Paul wrote 5 letters, or 3, or 2. He wrote several letters, and 2 Corinthians was not one of them. 2 Corinthians was a later amalgam made by a later editor of Paul. So the original writing of Paul is not the original 2 Corinthians. So maybe you could say that the copy that was later created by cutting and pasting is the original 2 Corinthians. Well, you could say that, but Paul didn't write that. He wrote the individual letters that were later cut and pasted together. Moreover, we don't have access to this letter that was made by combining these various letters. What we have access to is the collection, because we don't have manuscripts that go back to the letters that were circulating independently before the collection. All of the manuscripts that we have go back to the collection. We can't get behind the collection. And so, what is the original? And who is to say? We can't reconstruct anything before the collection was made, because we don't have any manuscripts that go back to those individual letters before that event. But if we try to reconstruct the original form of the collection, that's not the original form of the text that Paul himself wrote. Moreover, the one letter we're interested in the collection, 2 Corinthians, was not one letter, but 3 or 4 or 5. This is a very confusing situation, but it's the historical reality, which is one of the reasons why top scholars throughout the English-speaking world have abandoned the idea that we can reconstruct some kind of original text. It's impossible to know even what it means to speak of an original. And 2 Corinthians is not the only problem. The book of Acts in the New Testament, the 5th book of the New Testament, appears in 2 different forms in our manuscripts. 2 major forms of the text. One form of the text of the book of Acts is 8.5% longer than the other. Many scholars think that whoever wrote Acts, call him Luke, published 2 editions of the work, a shorter one and a longer one that he later edited. If so, what is the original? The shorter or the longer? The Gospel of John. Scholars have long recognized that the epilogue found in John chapter 21, where Jesus has several resurrection appearances before his disciples, was not originally part of the Gospel of John, but was tacked on later. It wasn't originally there. Again, this is just a common view among New Testament scholars throughout Europe and North America. But all of our manuscripts have it. So what is the original text of John? Is it with 21 or without 21? And what about the prologue of John? That very famous passage, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This passage, the prologue of John, has numerous themes found nowhere else in the Gospel of John, and the writing style is radically different from everywhere else in the Gospel of John, so that many scholars think chapters 1, verses 1 through 18 were added to John after it had originally been published. Yet all the manuscripts have it. So which is the original text? The Gospel of Luke. Luke begins with the story of Jesus' virgin birth in Bethlehem, chapters 1 and 2. But scholars have long recognized that chapter 3 looks like the original beginning of the book, that it didn't originally have chapters 1 and 2. But the manuscripts all have chapters 1 and 2. So what is the original text? If it was originally published without chapters 1 and 2, shouldn't we begin our Bibles with Luke chapter 3? Or the Gospel of Mark? Mark's gospel ends with the women going to the tomb after Jesus has been raised from the dead, seeing a man there who tells them that they're to go to Galilee, tell the disciples to go to Galilee, where Jesus will meet them. But the women flee from the tomb and they don't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. End of gospel. Many scholars think that the gospel ends too abruptly. You can't end a gospel without Jesus showing up to the disciples after the resurrection. And many scholars think that a page has been lost. If a page has been lost from the end of the gospel, what's the original gospel? If it's the gospel with the original page, we don't have any access to it. If you say it's the gospel without the original page, then you're saying a later form of the gospel is the original gospel, and that hardly makes sense. And so we have it. A problem with the original. How do we know what the original is? Does it make sense even to talk about the original? This is the theoretical problem we have in even mentioning the original. So that's problem one. What does the original text even mean? Problem two, where are the early manuscripts of the New Testament? Let me say something about the surviving copies of the New Testament. Today we have some 5,500 copies of the New Testament. By last week, the official count was 5,560 manuscripts that had been cataloged of the Greek New Testament. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. That is far more than for any other book in the ancient world. Far more than any other, way more than any book of Homer, or of Plato, or Aeschylus, or Sophocles, or Euripides, or pick your author. We have far, far more manuscripts of the New Testament than any other book in the ancient world, by a long shot. So just take that as a given. And the reason's obvious, because the people copying books in the Middle Ages were monks in monasteries. They're the ones who gave us our surviving books. And which books were they interested in? Were they principally interested in Aeschylus or Plato? Or not principally, they were principally interested in the Bible. So they copied the Bible. That's why we have thousands of these manuscripts. The problem is not the number of manuscripts or the fact that we have more than for any other author of antiquity. The problem is the ages of these manuscripts. How many manuscripts of the New Testament do we have from the first Christian century? None. From the decades after the books were written, how many do we have? The years afterwards, the decade, none. Zero. How many do we have from the early 2nd century? Say, manuscripts that clearly date up to around the year 150. We have one scrap. This is it. This may look big because it's a big screen. This is the actual size. It's the size of a credit card. It's written on both front and back. It's from John chapter 18. It has several verses on it. You can see this little scrap has parts of 7 lines on it. It's a very important manuscript because it's the earliest one we have. It's the early 2nd century, and it is the only manuscript we have from the early 2nd century. That's it. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? We're not just talking about decades now after these things were originally written and copied and mistakes made and mistakes replicated and then more mistakes made and more replicated. We're not talking about years or decades. We're talking about centuries. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the 2nd and 3rd centuries? None. Zero. Well, if we have 5,500 manuscripts, where are they from? When are they from? Well, 94% of our surviving manuscripts come from the 9th century and later. 94% come from the 9th century, which is great if you want to know what the Bible looked like when Christians were reading it in the year 890. But if you want to know how they were reading it in the year 70, you've got a problem, because you don't have manuscripts from that period. If you wanted to make a stack of the Bibles that are available to scholars today in manuscript form, the stack would go up to the ceiling. If you want to make a stack of the manuscripts that were made within, say, 60 or 80 years of the production of these books, you wouldn't be able to see the stack if we put it on the stage, because there's hardly anything. Let me say a few more things about the surviving copies of the New Testament and point out some of the problems we have with the surviving manuscripts. First, number of mistakes. I've told you that when scribes copy manuscripts, they make mistakes. And maybe you're thinking, yeah, well, says you. Is there like evidence of this, or is this just one of your other crazy opinions? Well, again, it is one of my crazy opinions, but there turns out to be evidence. We have 5,500 manuscripts of the New Testament. It is striking that when you compare these with one another in detail, no two of them are exactly alike in their wording. They all differ. Why do they differ? Because people are changing the text. Well, how many differences are there exactly? So, scholars have wondered about this for over 300 years. In the year 1707, there was a famous scholar named John Mill, who was an Oxford scholar, not related to John Stuart Mill, whom you may have heard of before. This is a different John Mill. John Mill spent 30 years of his life studying the manuscripts available to him. He had about 100 Greek manuscripts that he could examine. And he had the quotations of the New Testament in the ancient translations of the New Testament into Coptic and Syriac and Latin and so forth. And he had some quotations of the New Testament in the writings of the church fathers. And he had a bunch of evidence. And he looked at this evidence. And in 1707, after 30 years of labor, he published a book called the Novum Testamentum Graeci, the Greek New Testament. In this book, he gave a few lines of the text of the New Testament, and then below it indicated places where the manuscripts he looked at differed from one another. So this was an apparatus of readings. The apparatus showed where the manuscripts differed from one another. To the shock and dismay of many readers, John Mill's Novum Testamentum Graeci, in the apparatus, he indicated 30,000 places of difference among the manuscripts that he had examined. 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed from one another. And he was looking at 100 manuscripts. We have 5,500 manuscripts today. Well, how many differences are there among these manuscripts exactly? No one knows, because no one's been able to count them all. Some scholars say 200,000 differences. Some say 300,000 differences. Probably more accurately, 400,000 differences. It's easiest to put it in comparative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's a lot of differences. Well, those are the differences we have. What about differences that were put into the manuscript before our surviving copies started appearing? Our New Testaments today, our Novum Testamentum Graeci, are largely based on manuscripts produced in the 4th century. Sometimes manuscripts in the 3rd century are helpful, sometimes they're extremely helpful, sometimes they're relatively full, but for the most part, our Greek New Testaments agree with manuscripts found in the middle of the 4th century, 2 manuscripts in particular. These 4th century manuscripts differ significantly from the manuscripts of the 9th century. The 4th century manuscripts we rely on differ significantly from the ones from the 9th century. If they differ significantly from the 9th century manuscripts, why should we think that they are very similar to the manuscripts of the 1st century? We simply can't tell because we don't have any 1st century manuscripts to compare them to. But there are several things that we can say. Our earliest surviving manuscripts, the papyrus manuscripts that are very old, older than the 4th century, differ from one another more than the later manuscripts differ from one another, and the early manuscripts differ more from the later manuscripts than the later manuscripts differ from one another. This shows that the early transmission of the text was not carefully controlled. Moreover, the scribes who produced these earliest manuscripts, as a rule, appear to be much worse than the later scribes. As a matter of fact, it is generally conceded by textual scholars throughout the world that the most radical changes to the text of the New Testament were made during the first 150 years of its transmission. During the first 150 years is when most of the changes were made, but those are the centuries for which we have no manuscripts. The later manuscripts that we do have were all based on those earlier ones that were lost that appear to have been quite different from one another. What possible grounds could we have for assuming that the earliest manuscripts, whose copies we don't have, produced highly accurate accounts? What evidence could we have? We don't have evidence. How important are all these mistakes? 400,000 mistakes how important are they? Two things to say. First, most of these mistakes, in fact, are not important at all. Let me stress this point, as I think Dan will probably want to stress it as well. Most of the mistakes we have in our manuscripts are completely insignificant, immaterial, and matter for nothing more than to show that scribes in the ancient world could spell no better than students can today. And scribes didn't have spell check. I mean, I don't know about Dallas Theological Seminary, but at UNC, it's a complete mystery. How do students turn in papers with misspelled words? I mean, the computer tells you it was misspelled. I mean, how smart do you have to be? It's got a red line under it. Anyway, scribes didn't have that luxury. Scribes didn't even have dictionaries. Scribes often didn't care how they spelled words. We know that scribes didn't care how they spelled words because sometimes you have a scribe writing the same word on 3 lines in 3 different ways. He just didn't care. And all 3 would count as a difference. Lots of differences don't matter. Sometimes scribes will leave out a word, they'll leave out a line. Sometimes scribes will leave out a page. I mean, that would matter, but you can tell when it's happened, and so it's not a big deal. Most things don't matter. There are some changes, though, that matter. Some of the differences in our manuscripts matter a lot. Not 400,000 of them, but a lot of them do, as we'll see in a minute. Let me summarize what we have. We have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of copies of the New Testament, as Dan will no doubt stress. We have lots and lots and lots more copies of the New Testament than any other book in the ancient world, without any other book even coming close. That's absolutely true. That's what we have. What we don't have are lots of early copies, which are the copies that we want, and we don't have lots of accurate copies. What we want are early and accurate copies, and we don't have them. So it's not good enough to say we have lots of manuscripts if you can't say that we have reliable manuscripts and early manuscripts. My first problem was, my timer. My first problem, what does the original text even mean? Second problem, where are the early manuscripts? And my very quick final third point, why can't scholars agree? If we can get back to the New Testament reliably, if we can reliably reconstruct the original Greek New Testament, why haven't we? It's not for want of effort. Scholars have massive disagreements on this, that, and the other thing up and down the line, year after year, decade after decade. Scholars can't agree on what the original text is supposed to be. Over the centuries, these disagreements have been very important. They have involved such crucial doctrines as the doctrine of the Trinity, which relates to textual problems. The full divinity of Christ, affected by textual problems. The full humanity of Christ, affected by textual problems. The atoning sacrifice of his death, affected by textual problems. Favorite stories of Jesus' life, affected by textual problems. The proof of the pudding is in the tasting. In the year 2005, there were 2 scholars who put together an edition of the Greek New Testament, which they claimed was the original New Testament, the original Greek. 5 years later, in the year 2010, another scholar put together an edition of the Greek New Testament. It differed from the 2005 version in nearly 6,000 places. After all the manuscript discoveries we've made, after all the technological developments, after all the methodological developments, after all the research, we have 2 editions that differ in 6,000 places. And that's only counting the places that are mentioned in the apparatus. No one knows how many times they differ overall. At least the 2 editors don't, because I asked them yesterday. Let me draw conclusions very quickly. I have addressed the question whether the original New Testament is lost, and the answer is absolutely yes, it is lost. I've asked, can we reconstruct the lost originals? And here I have pointed to what I consider to be insurmountable problems. The 3 questions I've asked are questions that Dan is going to need to answer for us. It will not be good enough for him to say that we have lots and lots and lots of surviving manuscripts, or that we have more manuscripts than for any other writing from the ancient world. Both things are true, but they do not address the problems. The problems are that we don't even agree among ourselves what it means to talk about the original text, that even though we have many thousands of manuscripts from later periods, we do not have any manuscripts from the early periods that we're interested in, and that even though we may want to reconstruct the original text, however we define it, we have shown ourselves unable to do so time after time after time.